say that most of us have felt the pain of compliance. It can be quite cumbersome, time-consuming, and also very expensive. We understand that it costs around $270 billion a year. So my first question to Paolo is it time to move away from a control layer to a compliance by design layer? And I think we talked about it a little bit in the first panel, but I would love to hear your thoughts on that. So basically we want to do this very organically, so I'm not going to direct the question to any of you, but feel free to. I would like to hear all of your thoughts.
Happy to go first. So as someone who has worked at the Centric Consortium, which was the circle point-based joint venture that governed truly a form of money, and I see that now that we are building this new layer of programmable money, the money that we can actually program, that means we can also have compliance by design, programmable compliance, and also programmable risk management. And this just means that we need to build a tech stack to support programmable money. And it's very exciting times to do this because we all are very familiar with the privacy enhancing technologies of zero knowledge proofs, where ZK proofs are about proving a negative, but also multi-party computation, where we can be able to start accessing data sets at different organizations, perhaps different banks, different financial institutions, or who are suspicious actors, without having to share all that personal data amongst multiple parties. This is a type of compliance that I'm really hoping regulators will start to accept. But as a former regulator, I do recognize that our regulations have been built on third-party reporting, and it's been decades of regulatory framework, a legal liability framework that's really built on third-party reporting. So can we move towards a compliance regime that actually can support decentralization? That is my hope.
Absolutely. I mean, I would also like to share with you some my own practical experience when I was talking with 1inch like 4 or 5 years ago about getting licensed in Germany, because the founders from 1inch, they're from Germany. So I was looking into the business model almost 5 years ago, and I told them it is too early. I mean, if I go to BaFin and I do an application for a license, they will not understand it. So you will destroy your business. And this is, I think, the problem we have with innovation. If you try to force the regulation to your business and it doesn't really work, you may just jeopardize your business and it doesn't work out. So what I told them at that time, look into different jurisdictions. They have an SRO in Switzerland, but I told them to look into Dubai at that time, and then suddenly Dubai became like the next hub. And they're doing that. So, but now what we see is like, if you want to have corporate and business players doing DeFi trading or doing DeFi, there's one specific compliance which needs to be like 100% compliant, which is AML. And you cannot have institutionals doing DeFi trading without being compliant from an AML perspective. This is why if you look at the white paper at 1inch, which is a security white paper, and you see how many tools 1inch is using. It's massive. They have 9 tools, and they do basically everything from KYC to sanction check to bad actors listing and all of that. And they use this fundament now for introducing that to BARA, to the Dubai authority, to show them that there is a way to have both things. Have on one side AML compliance, really 100%, even 150%, and on the other hand, having like the DeFi as a liquidity layer behind it, being not regulated. So it's working to do both things, and I think it's a very nice example. But I would also like to hear what you think, Reto.
Yeah, very interesting topics, especially also maybe the stablecoin. It's exactly a discussion we are having in Switzerland right now with the regulators. The regulator jumped in last year with a new guidance, actually requiring the whole, not only at issuance and redemption, but every token holder to be onboarded. So in principle, a whitelisting by the issuer itself, which obviously destroys the market. And there we are taking up discussion exactly to use and to show the regulator and also the government that technology can, I mean, obviously we won't do 100% KYC, but we have solutions in the middle supported by technology. Instead of, you can do easy thing, whitelisting not by the issuer but maybe by a group of gatekeepers, or you can go a step further to blacklisting, or go to account agnostic, account abstraction principles, use smart contract wallets, zero knowledge proof. So there are so many possibilities, and I mean in the end regulation is there because there is a market failure, and that's where the regulators come in. But if we can show that the technologies helps us, that there is no market failure, why not go back actually?
Yeah. Thank you. So I will maybe start from a different perspective, from the privacy GDPR perspective. Privacy is an important part of my work. I'm data protection officer of some companies, and the idea of privacy by design, by default, is a cornerstone of GDPR. Article 25 states that very clearly. And there is I think that this is a very important concept, that when you really build the tech, lawyers or people that have an understanding of compliance should be involved since the beginning. Because there is a big problem in privacy, in GDPR compliance around Europe, that there are a lot of, and we are of public procurement in Europe, that of course involves a lot of technology, because now everything is technology, so you cannot do anything without technology. So there are multi-million public procurement contracts all over Europe, and I can have direct knowledge in my country, in Italy, of this. So what happens is that, for example, municipalities, they award a multi-million dollars to a tech company. They build all the tech, so maybe 100 million euro, and then at the end, they call a data protection officer, which say, no, that's not possible, because it's, yeah, that's crazy, but that's the way it is. And so, what do? Do you undo a 100 million IT platform because it's not compliant with GDPR? Or what do you do? So I really think that lawyers or people that have an understanding of compliance should be really involved, but since the beginning, because that's the real meaning of by design, by default. Since the beginning, when everything is not real at the level of coding, it's still at the level of just designing the main idea of a tech, that should be involved at that time. Otherwise, it's just late. It's just trying to put a solution at the last time, which doesn't work.
I agree totally. I call this preventative lawyering, right? So the earlier you bring the lawyers in, the easier it will get for you in the end. But my questions, I have a follow-up for you guys on this one. So the regulators, and I take your point that we can't push the regulators, but also the regulatory needle is very slow sometimes, right? And this technology moves way too fast. So how can we find a way to bring them over with us on this decentralization idea that maybe speeds up the process a little bit? And I would like to you, Alireza, is 1inch using third parties to do the 8-layer due diligence that you mentioned, or is everything built on chain?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a mix basically. So what they're using, what also traditional bank or financial institution is using, like KYC identification providers, they use it. They use also chain analysis and also other tools for checks. But they also have built up their own tools, Shield, where they combine external knowledge with own knowledge, and they also share a lot of data with other DeFi players, which is maybe from a data protection perspective critical, but we say, okay, if it's a bad actor and you have to act fast and share the information about the bad actor with the other exchanges, then you do something to protect the DeFi environment. So and in that respect, as I said, this is what is happening, that using both like internal but also external tools. And to your question specifically, what can be done to have the regulators, or maybe the ethos, like the European Security Supervision Authorities, and also the NCAs to cooperate more in respect to DeFi and decentralization. I think what we all know is that it's not covered by MiCA 1.0, but it may be covered by MiCA 2.0. And this is also the position of the European Commission, also of ESMA, that for now, national regulators should not try to regulate DeFi. Unfortunately, in Germany, we see different movement, and this is something which is not in line with what is like agreed on a gentleman's basis agreement. But this is what we see. But what we can do, I think we can just look back of how the MiCA 1.0 was developed. There was like this advice papers from ESMA and EBA, which came out on the same day in 2019. So we need something similar to that. So we can actually take the development or the establishment of MiCA 1.0 as a blue pause, but do it better than the first version. Yeah. And I think communication is very important between the NCAs, but also between the market players. And these consultations, which we had in the past, like coming closely to Christmas or to some holidays where no one really has time to do consultation, this is nonsense. You should really give the opportunity to do consultations in paper, but also to meet in person, to have like events, if meeting in Brussels or meeting with the NCAs. I think this is very important, to bring them together. German BaFin has the BaFin Tech, which is every year. We see it in Abu Dhabi by the end of the year that the regulator is inviting the market players, and I think this is very important. Bring them together to a table and discuss both needs from both sides and to see how you can find a common solution.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on that? I think Switzerland is quite good to regulate.
I don't know. No, but I have my view. With quite strict regulations, but I think overall it's important. We see this also when we speak with the regulator in Switzerland. We have our roundtables with FINMA, we meet at conferences, we meet in bilateral supervision meetings, whatever. And interestingly, I mean, it's not so much talking about the actual legal stuff in the end now today. It's more really about, maybe we can call it educating the regulator in understanding the technology or specific aspects there or elements which can help to achieve a certain result, obviously, or to argue that something is not needed centrally, which is there maybe in TradFi. It's mostly about this educational aspect, and obviously also here FINMA is maybe also not always that open, and it sounded very familiar what Alireza told me. I mean, the last time the stablecoin guidance was issued without consultation before, in the middle of summer holidays of everyone, by intent obviously, no one would say it, but and it's, yeah, in the end we have to educate them, and so, because in the end they must, if they should not regulate DeFi, they must obviously trust in it and trust in the technology that it works. And this is not a process we can achieve in one day, obviously.
Oh, sorry, please.
Well, I just want to build on what Reto and Alireza said. You mentioned showing that there was no market failure. As a former regulator, I think I have a right to make this argument. I think that we have a regulatory failure with AML, and this is a US example, but in the US last year, US banks spent over $5.1 trillion on Bank Secrecy Act, AML, regulatory compliance. But that stopped only 1% to 2% of all illicit activities. I call that regulatory failure. And if we can come together as an industry and show, hey, the way we are building is actually more effective in stopping money laundering and stopping fraud, I think that will speak much more in terms of volume, rationality, logic to regulators and policymakers.
I wanted to add that I had some, like probably Alireza, some other people here, some preliminary meetings with the Italian financial authority. They were not very supportive, I would say, to say the least. And by the way, I think there is, in my opinion, a cultural problem also, because most of the people that sit in the financial authority or work for the financial authority, they really don't have an understanding, or from a cultural point of view, of what is technology, what is decentralization. They are really old people, even if they are young from their age, but in their mind, they are really come from an old traditional financial law culture. So they really don't understand, and I think that should be. Really, this cultural problem should be addressed some way. Otherwise, they think that when they see a crypto exchange, they think that that's the traditional bank, the traditional investment firm, which is different because the DNA is totally different.
I agree. And what Caitlin was saying in the first panel, we are held to impossible high standards, right? So when they see crypto, that's it. You're a bad actor, convince me otherwise. And it shouldn't be like that. And for us to find that middle ground, that should be a mindset change from the regulators. But yeah, we're up for the challenge, aren't we? That's why we're here. But let's talk a little bit more about decentralization. And I would love to hear more about Athena and their experience. We would love to be able to rely on decentralized players, including IDOS, to make sure that we are compliant with these rules and regulations. But do you have any experience on your day-to-day lives that we can make that happen, and it's already happening? For example, validators, right? Decentralization is very much linked to validators. Are we okay in KYC validators, in making sure there are thresholds and requirements to onboard new validators? What does that mean, sufficient decentralization, in your opinion? No pressure. Go for it.
I would say that probably there should be found somehow new ways of trying to strike a balance between compliance, because at the end of the day, compliance is to find someone accountable, which is probably what is law, because at the end of the day, a sanction, compensation requires someone who pays. So that's and decentralization is the opposite. So maybe should we find something in between, some kind of balance. And I think from a corporate structure point of view, while in the first early years of crypto, there was all this idea of just staying decentralized, 100% decentralized, no entity, no company. Now that is more or less over, and a lot of projects, or most of the projects, are created their own legal wrapper. Probably, in my opinion, there should be a legal entity is important, but there might be pieces of decentralization in a project, meaning that, for example, some task or some part of the project can be executed under decentralized shape or decentralized framework, while other part necessarily need a centralized entity. In other words, a legal entity which gives a legal protection. And for example, she was, or Marina also was speaking about DORA, and DORA mandates a lot of, some of the policies which are mandated by DORA are decisions which have to be adopted by the board of directors. So I repeat, they are mandated, they are not just optional. Just the regulation itself says that the board of directors has to adopt some decisions. So I think that even in a project or in an entity partially decentralized, at the board of directors level, there should be formally decisions which adopt some compliance, some compliance framework should be adopted at the level of the board of directors.
Understood. Thank you.
Sorry. Touching on what you said, what you both said, very interesting, because if you look at DORA and you look at the CASPs or at the financial institutions which have to comply with DORA, there's a requirement that they must identify their ITC service providers. So And if you now apply that to the blockchain and also with the validators, so if you use a blockchain like the T-Rex standard, for example, which we have in Luxembourg, so you use a blockchain for tokenizing securities. Does DORA apply to the blockchain and to those actors who help to keep the blockchain and the transactions working, like the validators or others? If the answer is yes, how can you make sure that it's DORA compliant? I think it's possible, and that's a very interesting question. And this is something which so far not many look into it. But if you really want to look into it, and as I understand, if you're doing like a MiCA application now, I think ESMA was asking then NCAs to also pay attention to DORA compliance. So and I would say, okay, I did this task once for some bridging services, and for bridging services we had some validators who were like located in Germany. They wanted to know from me if they need to identify them, and here we have to make sure that these German-based validators are not doing active solicitation because they're in a third country, and this kind of stuff. And otherwise they were like afraid that they maybe do crypto transfer service or something in that respect. So this is very important for compliance reasons. Compliant as a broader term. Compliant in this perspective means first to know who are your validators, where are they located, what are they exactly doing, do they comply with DORA rules or AML rules, and this is very, very tricky. I mean, it's not something where I can say I have the answer for it. I just want to share with you that I have lots of concerns in that respect.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to put a U.S. perspective on this, the SEC held its first crypto roundtable 2 Fridays ago, and the main topic of discussion was what is decentralization, and that is what the SEC is grappling with right now. And it turned into a question of not only what is what counts as decentralization, but what is the definition of control, and what does that mean, control? Who controls a blockchain? When does it count when you is it 51% of the validators that you have control, or is just being able to contribute to the code? Does that mean you have control? And so that is literally what we're grappling with right now in the U.S. But what, to me, what we're kind of cursed with is the term decentralization. I think it was just a bad term to begin with. I work with engineers, so I understand where they come from, but as a lawyer, it's like, no, that's a terrible word. It just, to me, we should rebrand it as not only distributed, but also self-managed, community managed. And so that is, I think that's part of the education we have to do with regulators. And and speaking of Italy, I was just at the Bank of Italy yesterday, and at the conference, your securities regulator announced their consultation on launching a new securities market that can be on the ledger. And I was very excited. I was like, oh wow, they're so forward thinking. Like, I couldn't imagine that in the US. But then they mentioned that the ledger has to have a manager who's responsible. And then suddenly I'm like, that's not a distributed ledger anymore. That's just a regular securities exchange. And so I think this is, it still really comes down to that concept of control, and can we accept systems that are controlled not by one, but by many people, by a whole community.
Without having to know who are those many people, where they are, and what they're doing, right? So that's the permissionless part of it. Sorry, Reto?
No problem. It's actually very interesting. Referring to you two, on the one side, I have maybe two quite different examples from Switzerland. I mean, just regarding, we don't have DORA in the sense that because we are not member of the EU, but we apply similar principles in the end. But just last month, FINMA granted the first DLT trading facility license, which is like the DLT exchange pilot regime in the EU. And they are gonna operate on Ethereum, a public blockchain. So, I mean, they obviously had to show to FINMA that it works, but it had not to be managed by someone. I think it's to the contrary. On the one hand, they have to show that it's not really fully controlled by any third party or has negative influence, something like that, but then they accept it, and some business continuity things and replacement blockchain and so on. But on the other side, we apply in the AML area, it comes this significant influence or control, which we also talk about in the crypto asset reporting framework also, where their FINMA is very hard in the sense that she's really looking on this, she calls it regulatory anchor points, indications that something could be not decentralized, and in the end nothing is decentralized with that, or the ownership keys of smart contracts or admin keys, do you have them as an operator, or more than half of the validators run by someone, or has someone 40% of the governance tokens in treasury and can vote, or the fee flows go they back to the operator, or does he operate the front end? So it goes quite far, and actually you have no chance to get out of it, and that's why we lost DeFi in Switzerland from an AML perspective, at least. We are applying exactly this, and it does not really work, unfortunately.
I just wanted to add something. This decentralization, we have it also in MiCA, like fully decentralized, and I think it was someone from ESMA who suggested to put this word in there, and then we asked ESMA, what does it mean? And we don't know. So I wrote a paper on that, and my suggestion was, from a regulatory perspective, to say that fully decentralized means that there's no person who's doing an activity which may be regulated. If you have activities like, I don't know, providing the internet service or something like this, so this is not a regulated activity. It is essential to do the service, that's right, but it's not a regulated activity itself. So it's the same if you apply it to blockchain. Validation and mining is not, in my opinion, it's not a regulated activity. This is why you should not look at them. And so I was suggesting to look either at the governance token holders, and to see if there's like someone who can really influence the activity of the protocol or of the foundation or of the DAO, or to look if there's anyone in between who's maybe doing execution services or any brokerage activities in this respect, to find someone who's like the intermediary who could be, then you say this is not fully decentralized because there is a person who's doing a regulated activity. So this was my suggestion. And coming back to your point regarding what Italy is doing, we did this in Germany already. So we have in Germany the so-called crypto securities register. And I remember back in 2018, I think it was in 19, when I was invited to the first hearing, when we were discussing exactly this, to say that we have electronic securities on the blockchain. We were discussing the need. Does this need to be regulated? Must there be like a company who's regulated, who's acting as the manager, like doing the register keeper? Or we suggest at that time of the Blockchain Association in Germany, we don't really need a regulated party. We need a person who's reliable. So in the end, you can take anyone who's maybe audited. So maybe it's better to educate auditors, or to have auditors who are licensed, who can really confirm that this is working. Because in the license which you get in the end of the day, we have a couple of these crypto securities register keepers in Germany, the license doesn't say anything. It doesn't really say that is the business done properly or not, because it's very new. You can't really say it. In the end of the day, you take these regulated players, you do an audit, maybe you do a special audit, then you find out, oh, they don't really comply with what they have put on paper. Yeah? Not ending this discussion, but maybe putting something else which we can discuss on. What you also said, Reto, was very interesting, because when we talk about decentralization and compliance, that in Switzerland, if you do a stablecoin issuance, that you need to whitelist the holders. It's very interesting, because there are also some people here from Switzerland now who just joined, who have like this D-Euro stablecoin, which is based on a decentralized structure. I'm just wondering how does FINMA or how does the regulator wants to, who's the obliged party in doing the token holder identification? I mean, this is for me. I mean, how do you bring this both worlds together? This decentralized world and the compliance world. Yeah.
I think with the euro and also similar projects, I mean, you have two ways to go. One is to try to do it in the centralized, compliant way, then you have to onboard everyone. Or the other way, which certain projects are trying to do, is really go for fully decentralized, and then there's no control there, and no one is really accountable in the end for it, and so there's no compliance. To be honest, if FINMA will have a close look at it, if it works, I'm frank, I don't know. Maybe there will be enforcement, maybe not. It really depends on the specific design, and yeah, this I don't know.
Yeah, so when I think about compliance and decentralization, I'm really thinking about compliance in DeFi. And to me, DeFi is self-managed finance. So you have to bring it back to the individual, back to the user. And this is where decentralized identity is so powerful. And this particular tech stack that you guys are building, it's extremely important because this is how we as users will be able to control our identity assets. And here, the EU is at the forefront of building formal decentralized identity through the EU DI wallets. And sometimes I'm not sure if the member states actually understand what they're building. And I actually would love to hear everyone's thoughts in the room as well about what, for example, Sprund, the agency building the EU DI wallet for Germany. I'm only just learning last week that they announced that their latest features will include the ability for the German member state to revoke the EU DI wallet. And for me, I'm like, okay, it's one thing to say, I can revoke as the German state, I can revoke your national ID credential. All right, fine, you issue the credential, you have the right to revoke it. But to revoke my entire digital wallet, like what if I have credentials from my employer or my university or my bank, etc.? Like, does this mean you can revoke all of that too? And how does this comply with privacy rights under GDPR? How does this also comply with property rights in terms of these identity assets are my assets? So I'm just bringing this up as part of the really important ecosystem of compliance in terms of self-managed finance, self-managed identity.
Thank you. Go
Thank you. No, I wanted to add, and building on what she was saying, that I think that, for example, Mika has written that Mika is technological neutral, but I think that decentralization is not neutral from a value point of view. I mean, there is tech. You can have a register of built on blockchain, totally centralized. So it's just not using the word of the tech of blockchain that makes something decentralized. It's just also a culture, if I may use this word, or a set of values which has to be shared by all the participants. And if you take away the value of decentralization as a cultural value, as a shared value, you have an hollow tech, which is really the blockchain, but that there is no decentralization. So this part is, in my opinion, most of the time not really recognized by the regulators by this point. This should be really given the importance.
I agree, and I love the idea of self-management, and it's interesting to your point about if we think about the Bybit hack, right? So we know that some DeFi protocols were under a lot of pressure to block the transactions, and then you go, okay, consensus mechanism. If you have enough consensus that they want to do that, does that mean that they have control over it? What does that mean from a decentralized point of view? from an enforcement perspective, for example. Sorry, Reto, you want to add something?
It's a very interesting point, and I obviously cannot solve it, but we have another example there in Switzerland which goes into the other direction, interestingly. We can tokenize securities and issue ledger-based securities based on our normal securities laws. And there's a requirement in it that the issuer must not be allowed to be able to transpose of the assets of the blockchain, so the securities issued. And now a lot of questions come up with regard to compliance, because if you are very strict there, it means you cannot freeze, you cannot pause, you can certainly not take it back or delete it or burn it, whatever. But there's the big discussion now going on. How far can you go? Maybe freeze is okay if it's sanctions, maybe not. Or is it already allowed if the user, obviously, when it is issued, contractually agrees that the issuer can do things? It's exactly this discussion, but coming from the other standpoint, that he's actually not allowed, because it must be decentralized. It is blockchain in the end. But yeah, now we have the problems how to comply, and it's the issuers coming to us. We must somehow comply. So yeah, there we're coming from the other direction, interesting.
See, we have many more questions than answers, but we'll keep going. To Paolo's point about accountability, right? So the more decentralized tools that we are using, the more shared liability might exist. So how do you guys see in terms of who is the accountable person when you're talking about a decentralized system? If you are relying on a third-party decentralized AML KYC provider, where does the buck stop?
Well,
you cannot pass at this point.
It's a technology principle or possibility that you have shared liability, but to be honest, from a regulatory perspective or liability perspective, there's no shared liability. Maybe joint liability of everyone to the fullest extent, but not a shared one, because if you have shared liability, there must be someone accountant from a regulatory perspective. This makes it so difficult here. I'm sorry, I cannot solve it. It's really, but maybe I'm really interested to hear what you think.
Yeah. So under the FinCEN rules in the U.S., banks are responsible for their own KYC AML work. So that means they cannot rely on the AML KYC efforts of other banks. So I feel like that's actually a shame, because I think that Citibank's KYC due diligence is just as good as Bank of America's. So why can't Bank of America rely on Citibank's work? I do foresee a future where perhaps this can become a world of shared liability, and I'm starting to see some of that coming to fruition. For example, the BIS Innovation Hub in Singapore, they recently put out a report of one of their projects called Project Mandala. I highly recommend reading it, because there they use MPC for banks to share their data sets without having to see each other's data sets. And so they get to share their data sets and be able to essentially ping each other and make sure, okay, I have Alireza, and is he on your suspicious actors list at each individual bank? And the bank can all ping back yes or no without knowing that your name was shared. And so this is kind of the really impressive power of some of the privacy enhancing technologies, in particular MPC. And for banks to do that, they essentially have to share, liability, right? So I am hoping that we are moving in that direction.
I mean, I hope so too. We had a paper in 2018, I think, from FATF, from FATF it was, a recommendation on how to use the digital identity for sharing knowledge based maybe on blockchain to have really trust. But I think we're not going to get rid of what we have in the European Economic Area, that we say that the obligated party is responsible for the KYC identification of its customers. Of course, you can share information. We have Reliance model already now existing, but I think the future goal should be to have with Zero Knowledge and other tools sharing of data, which is relevant for everyone, without the need to make sure that the data is correct, because it is correct from the beginning once it gets in the system. Yeah, once it gets into the system, it's correct, and then you use the data, and then you're reliable as the obligated party that you did every obligation under AML law as it's supposed to be. Yeah, this could be a way forward, without the need that everyone needs to do a new identification with video ident or post ident or whatever ident. Once you have this information, this should be usable for everyone. Yeah.
Thank you. I was sorry. I wanted to add that from a GDPR perspective, that there is basically this will be probably a situation of a co-controllership, and maybe one of them might be at the same time a processor of the other. So I agree with him and everyone that at the end of the day there is always someone accountable. I mean, you can just say we are decentralized and no one here is accountable.
I agree with every one of you, and I think that's one of the challenges that Marjorie mentioned earlier, right? Because of those obligations, we have the siloed information. The banks will say, no, I know that you're saying that you're a trusted party, but I'll do my KYC as well to make sure my bacon is saved. But I do believe that we can use decentralized tools, and we're getting there slowly with the IDOS and other solutions to make sure we get to a middle ground. A little bit of shared liability, but not too much, but at the same time, trusted information that we don't need to reapply. My goodness me. Proof of address every 3 months? That is very complicated. Yeah, sorry, you wanted to say something.
No, you're completely right, and I think we have, what I wanted to add, we have already in TradFi, this in Switzerland, but I believe you have it also, the trusted information concept. We have it already maybe in very small pieces, but you can either, the client comes directly to me and I look at his passport, make a copy, or he can send it to me by mail, but then he needs to let it legalize somewhere with a trusted party, a notary public or another regulated bank. And then as a bank I can rely on that. So in other words, there we have it already, for example, and why not rely on the whole KYC, maybe with the client simply also putting a button, I confirm that is still true, or whatever. Why not? It's a mindset and an approach.
But Reto, I'm absolutely with you. What we don't have is, you did this legalization with a notary or with a lawyer, and then this information is once certified. Yeah. Why can't you use this information then with another bank or with another payment service provider? Why do you have to do again a legalization? This is what I don't understand. And the idea would be to put it into the blockchain so it's immutable. Yeah. And in the beginning, before with the Oracle perspective, before it went on chain, someone confirmed this information is true. But once this happened and it's on chain, it's immutable. So why can't you then use it with all the obligated parties? Why do you need to tell the customer to do again this legalization, for example? Yeah.
I fully agree. That's what I say. We simply go a step further, and why not?
Yeah.
Because there's no difference.
Exactly.
Agree. This is much easier to do with identity, right? A passport or something, than with residency. So if you want to AML monitoring, whether you leave your proof of address, that becomes a little bit more complicated because you have the time period that expires. Yes, but I think I want to make sure we have time for questions. So my last question for you guys will be, how do you see compliance evolving from here, right? I think is a sweet spot to some extent, but where do we go from here?
maybe I can start first because it was yesterday on a tax bit roundtable, and what we discussed there was very interesting because we discussed compliance from a tax reporting perspective, and you have this DAC 8 and CAF, so crypto assets reporting framework, and this is also compliant. It's more compliance than taxation because in the end of the day, we see now that you need to get certain information from token holders, and you need to disclose this certain information with tax authorities, and this is a compliance topic, and this is, I think this is where, at least in the crypto environment, things are moving, that more and more data must be somehow shared, and I'm very concerned about that, as what you said, Paolo, with the de minimis rule, to say, why do you need to collect so many data? I mean, I heard that in Italy or somewhere, that you need to do, when you do KYC, like ML KYC, you also need to collect the tax ID. Why? I mean, I don't really understand it. Why do you need to collect the tax ID if you do a KYC check? We don't have it in Germany, and in the UK or some other places you do the gas bill check or something like this. We don't have it in Germany, but in Germany we have some other things. So, so more and more information getting collected for me, it doesn't look really reasonable. Yeah.
I think that where we are going, I hope we're going to some better situation than now. I do think that first of all, probably, possibly, there is still an increasingly somehow internationalization of compliance, if I may use this word. So this idea that authorities try to think in an internationalized way, which should be, for example, the idea of the European Union, while many authorities do not really rely on the information collected from other authorities. In MiCA, there is probably a problem like this. And so I think that still slowly, but more and more, there is like a more internationalized perspective about compliance, and more a use of digital data. Whether in blockchain or not in blockchain, but still more use of digital data. So the papers are disappearing, which is probably a good thing.
Linda?
So I don't know if this is where things will head, but this is where I hope things will head. I hope that our regulations, or financial regulations and tax regulation, will become more cognizant of privacy by design. And I had mentioned earlier that we have at least in the AML space, a broken regulatory model. In the US, FinCEN receives around almost 5 million reports a year on our financial transactions. And every time you send $10,000 to someone, the bank has to file a currency transaction report with FinCEN. But in the end, it's not FinCEN who actually uses those reports. It is the IRS, criminal investigations. 80% of all their cases actually come from AML reports. And I don't know how sharing's done here in the EU, but in the US, the tax authority actually relies on the AML reports to do a lot of its investigations. And unfortunately, this week, the Trump administration has lowered that $10,000 threshold to $200.
Oh, really?
Oh my God.
In 30 counties in the United States. Solely, my guess is to try to surveil immigrants. And then on top of that, the IRS has now come to an agreement with the Immigration and Control Authority, ICE, to share its tax information with ICE, so they can gather, I guess, more surveillance on migrants. So people who are undocumented workers but file taxes, their information can now be shared. This is where I feel like this is the slippery slope of government reporting, that we have this long-standing third-party reporting regime in regulation and in tax, but it can also be easily used by government for, unfortunately, other reasons.
The post of right and wrong keeps moving, eh? We need to keep,
Yeah, I think there's indeed the difference where we are actually heading at the moment. I think it's going more centralized compliance concept as CARF, as whatever, and we try to do the centralization on top of the decentralization, because in the end it's easier for the regulators. And that's why, and where I hope it goes in the same directions, that we can also, in the end we must be able to show to the regulator that privacy is also worth something, and the technology can also solve certain things and bring us certain things, so that we can actually live with less data. Why does every one of us need a copy of the full ID data and whatever data of the clients? And it's not sufficient that one has it and somehow it can be proved, maybe by zero knowledge proof or whatever, that it works. At least I'm happy that in the last point we are a little bit more reluctant in Switzerland that AML data is not shared with the tax authorities, tax data is not shared with other things, but on the other side, that's why Switzerland is very criticized internationally.
No comments. Paolo?
About your question that
What's next for compliance?
what's next for compliance? Well, I would say I agree with what everything has been said here. I would say that there is a. I hope that there is a. I mean, there is still. There will be an increasing use of as I was saying before, of digital data and technology, and that will be absolutely important.
Thank you very much. So what that means is that there will be lots of work for lawyers for the foreseeable future.